to introduce our speakers today. We have Jocelyn and Kris with us from the Freshwater Society, and their presentation today is Partnering with Water in Food Production, an Introduction to Managing Nutrient Runoff. And they have a really excellent presentation that they'll be sharing with us today. I'm very, very excited to hear it. So thank you so much, Kris and Jocelyn, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, for inviting us. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. So I'll get started. Bonjour, everyone. My name is Jocelyn, and Kris is the other freshwater staff who is presenting with me today. Before we jump into introductions, I'll just like to tell you a little bit more about our organization, Freshwater Society, or as we like to call it, Freshwater. So we are located in St. Paul, and we are a member-supported environmental nonprofit that works for clean and sustainable water in Minnesota. You can kind of see our mission on the screen. We do a lot of work. Kris co-runs the Minnesota Water Stewards Program, which certifies and supports community leaders to prevent water pollution and conserve and protect our waterways. I do a lot of facilitating on planning efforts with governments and communities to create these 10-year plans to better protect watersheds. We also play active roles in statewide policies. Before we go in, I do want to take a little bit of time to clarify some expectations. We view this presentation as a way to share what we've learned. And even though the presentation is going to be heavier on the Eurocentric knowledge and science, we will briefly introduce some great resources for Indigenous knowledge and perspectives and make time for you to share your cultural knowledge and ask questions. I think of both Anishinaabe and Western knowledges as systems of wisdom that's accumulated over time on how to protect land, water, ecosystems, and each other. And we can't ignore that cultural knowledge that you maintain from your ancestors without missing some very important details on what actually works for Fond Du Lac. So Kris, would you like to share a little about yourself?
Sure, I'd love to. Good evening. Thanks, Jocelyn. And I'm really happy to be here with everyone tonight. I too am a gardener. I plant veggies and fruit in an assortment of raised beds and bales on my small urban lot in Minneapolis. And I am still waiting impatiently for spring to show her face. I'm really excited to hear about the seeds that are being started in the seed giveaways, because it gives me hope as the wind whistles around here and the slush is kind of accumulating again. I will have the opportunity to talk a little bit later about regenerative agriculture and walk us into some Indigenous ways of knowing. So I'll give it back to Jocelyn. Thanks, Jess.
Perfect. So it'd be lovely to get to know you a little bit better. So if you could put in the chat your name, organization if you're affiliated with one, and then the answer to this question, which is, what is your relationship with agriculture? And it can be something that you're already doing or that you plan to do. And Kris beat me a little bit, but as you're putting things in the chat, I'm just going to go over all the topics that we're going to present today. So first, we'll share what we usually teach on nutrients and fertilizer. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know of Fond Du Lac's waters. We're going to talk through some general knowledge on regenerative agriculture. And then we're going to open that conversation with you on how Indigenous and Anishinaabe knowledge is crucial to the stewardship of water, lands, animals, and all that makes up Fond Du Lac. I've also asked Kelsey to send this PowerPoint to you later because it has links and details and you don't have to worry about taking a million notes. So we're going to start with Minnesota being a headwater state. And that means that the water leaving from our state impacts other states, Canada, and the Atlantic Ocean downstreams. 90% of Fond Du Lac's reservation drains into the St. Louis River, which is the largest tributary to Lake Superior and the Great Lakes on the US side. The Great Lakes make up 84% of all surface fresh water in North America and 21% of the world's supply of surface fresh water. So Fond Du Lac has significant influence on waters flowing elsewhere, and the good work you've done in caring for your waters is a huge responsibility. Just a little bit more definitions. What's a watershed? It's where all the water, rain, sleet, snow, hail, water sprinklers on lawns, irrigation, everything ends up collecting in. So smaller watersheds can be combined into a larger watersheds if all the water bodies have a common point, like a river and a lake. And these larger watershed basins, these larger watersheds are called basins. As this map shows, Fond du Lac is made up of 5 major watershed basins. Watersheds' health are tied to what we do. As rain, sleet, snow, things that we put on the ground water that we put on the ground fall to the ground, that stormwater runoff runs over the Earth's surface and picks up all the contaminants that are on the ground. And then that stormwater ends up flowing into water bodies like rivers, lakes, or wetlands, and they soak in where it lands, and they seep into our groundwater or into the roots of our plants. So this slide shows all the potential contaminants that stormwater can pick up. I included a picture of storm drains and culverts because their stormwater is rarely treated. And I want to let you know that as water evaporates, the contaminants stay, so they become even more concentrated in lakes and other water bodies. The reason why I listed this diverse list of contaminants is to show that both farmers and non-farmers all have a role to play in reducing contaminants. And then it brings us to, why do we focus on nutrients? I can't pronounce things. It's a little bit too late for me to present, so bear with me. Intuitively, it's easier to understand why pesticides and herbicides aren't good for wildlife or humans or our pets. So like, people are just more naturally careful about that. I think it's less obvious with fertilizer, and that's basically what nutrients are. And fertilizer is usually made up of phosphorus and nitrogen. It's often referred to as nitrate and nitrite because that's what the substance is when nitrogen dissolves into water. So I'm just going to refer from now on to all nitrogens as nitrates for this presentation. But I do want to let you know that fertilizer in agriculture is not the only source of nutrients. We also have other sources like malfunctioning septic systems. We do know that fertilizer, whether in backyard gardens or farming, are a significant source. In appropriate quantities, nitrogen and phosphorus are used up by the plants, and they're not going to cause a lot of runoff issues. But let me step back backwards a little bit. So when I talk about fertilizers, what do I mean? I mean chemical fertilizers or animal waste manure. What happens when we put too much fertilizer? Well, some of it runs off into the lakes, and that causes excessive algae growth that causes fish and other wildlife to die off. And this really hurts people who rely on fish or water plants for food, like Manuman. It can also hurt tourism and other economic sectors that depend on clean water or healthy ecosystems of wildlife and plants. Algae also has impacts on human health. And we'll go over a little bit about fertilizers' impact on human health in terms of drinking water in the next slide. The last part is, how do excess phosphorus that is not used by the plant leave the soil and go into water? Typically, phosphorus does that in 2 ways. And shortly after application, there's some water flow, and so it goes into the runoff. The other times, it bonds to soil particles and sediments. So if you're seeing a lot of soil wash off, that soil might carry with it phosphorus, pesticides, and other stuff that you don't want in the water. When we talk about direct human health impacts, we're more worried about nitrates than phosphorus. You don't have an issue with nitrates on the reservation right now. This is all just background information for if that day ever comes when you have a problem. And that's usually when you're seeing about 5 to 10 milligrams per liter of nitrates in your drinking water. There are 4 ways to ingest nitrates. So drinking water with high concentrations of it, eating leafy vegetables like spinach and lettuce because they have high concentrations, handling fertilizer. So just be very careful to protect yourself from inhaling or having skin contact. And then I like to put the young children just might put soil in their mouth. I know I did. The interesting thing about nitrates is that multiple exposures actually add up. So maybe your exposure to drinking water was low, but then you ate vegetables with high concentrations, and then you handle fertilizers without safety precautions. All of that together can put you over the limit. What happens when there's too much nitrate in the human body? Well, it reduces your body's ability to carry oxygen to cells. In this slide, you can see that we're really highlighting private wells. We know there are quite a lot of private well users on reservation, even though some residents use City of Cloquet's water. And we just highlight this because private well owners are more vulnerable. They have to test their own private wells, and they have to pay out of pocket for treatment if there's too much nitrate, arsenic, or other contaminants in their drinking water. So we encourage residents and growers living in places with high densities of private wells just to be extra careful about what you're putting on the ground. Limiting the use of fertilizer before it enters the groundwater is a lot cheaper and easier than treating contaminated water. And that can run up to $1,500 on average for a reverse osmosis system. So we're gonna do a little bit of a switch to talking about Fond Du Lac as I scroll. And this is from the Fond Du Lac's Office of Water Protection. It's a report that you can see on the screen, and there's a link here too. And the whole point of this part is to talk about how healthy Fond Du Lac is, and then to go over some of the maps in this report. So I want to say that Fond Du Lac is incredible. Half of the reservation is covered by lakes, streams, rivers, and wetlands. You have thriving fisheries and water habitats for wild rice and manumin. Fond Du Lac is home to 4 trout streams, which is quite rare. The areas that are less healthy, and when we say less healthy, we mean there's a little less species diversity, is a little bit more impacted by contaminants, or maybe humans have changed a little bit how the water flows through ditches. They're very few, and I'll just go over them kind of quickly. There are some septic systems and loss of vegetation along the shorelines for a big lake. This vegetation really helps filter out contaminants and runoff before that runoff enters into the lake. In Stony Brook, Fond Du Lac staff have worked to make sure that there is flowage despite some of the drainage ditches that were created in the early 1990s. It is also noteworthy that there is no nitrate issue right now on reservation. The only concerns that you have are phosphorus, such as Second Lake having some increasing phosphorus. Third Lake, Fond Du Lac has done an excellent job reducing phosphorus, working with the source of that phosphorus. And then First Lake has been impacted by past farming practices. Otherwise, you have very, very healthy waters, probably the healthiest waters I've ever worked on since I started this job, which is very lucky because, again, it is easier to protect healthy waters than to restore what is damaged. So let's move on to agriculture. This report talks about one of the reasons why agriculture on Fond Du Lac has not been a huge contributor of nutrients is because the geology and soils on reservations are not fertile enough to support those large scale operations where you have lots of fertilizer. And this is because much of the reservation is covered in wetland and forested land, which are also important sources of food and medicine. So most of the agriculture on reservation is small scale livestock operations, hay fields, and farms run by the Fond Du Lac tribal government to support food sovereignty efforts. We see a lot of alfalfa as being the main crop cultivated. Most of the livestock operations are too small to be considered feedlots, and the risk of nutrient and chemical runoff from hay fields is low. So in total, you have about 130 acres of the total 101,805 acres on reservation being devoted to agriculture. I include this map because these orange areas is where food is being cultivated, and that includes hay, pastures, and row crops. Wait, there we go. So this slide we're going to go over very quickly. You can come back and look at it if you want to learn more. But basically, if you're thinking of growing foods or raising livestock next to lakes or rivers running into lakes, it's nice to know that you're not putting too much fertilizer because that might lead to algae growth. I do want to say that the Fond Du Lac band have designated many of these lakes as shoreline districts with extra protections against development and human activities that will risk ecosystems' health. So I think consulting with Fond Du Lac staff will significantly lower the chances of algae becoming a problem. If you're away from the lakes, just see if your runoff is going off to a river or to a stream that might eventually end up in a lake. And if so, just want to be a little bit more extra careful about how much fertilizer you're putting in. So this map is just, this slide is just 2 maps for reference. On the left shows you where your feedlots are, and feedlots can contribute to nutrients through manure. Again, there doesn't seem to be any nitrate or phosphorus issues associated with the feedlots right now. There is one feedlot on reservation west of Gitigaan Lake, And then there are 2 feedlots outside of reservation. The map on the right, I wanted to show you this cool map because it shows what soil types are on reservation. It might be useful for growers who want to take a look at this and see where the best soil for growing plants are. And you guys see some of the best soil, like the sandy soil, silt, clay, loamy soil, being the same areas that we're seeing cultivation happening in that previous map. So we're going to turn to groundwater. Nearly 100% of all drinking water, and this includes water for livestock, come from groundwater. The exception is residents who are drawing on Cloquet's municipal water supply, because Cloquet uses a combination of groundwater and surface water and has a water treatment plant. So the regional groundwater mostly flows towards the St. Louis River. The reservoir has 3 aquifers where you draw on for drinking water. One is shallow and covers 1/3 of the reservation. Because it's closer to the earth's surface, it's easier for fertilizer, pesticides, or herbicides to seep into your drinking water. The other 2 aquifers are super great. They're very well protected. Either they're deeper in the ground or they've got some hard, solid rock like bedrock that's just protecting them. So all the private wells pull waters from the aquifers, and there are 743 recorded drinking wells on reservation. But we don't have an idea of the full scale of wells because before 1974, the Minnesota Department of Health didn't require sort of that documentation. And that's also when we started sampling newly constructed wells to check on nitrate levels. So these are the pollution sensitivity maps, and what they do is they find out how long it takes for a contaminant like fertilizer on the Earth's surface to travel into your groundwater that you drink from. The longer it takes for the contaminant to travel into groundwater, the more likely you're going to lose some of the contaminants to filtering by the soil, filtering by roots, and we're going to be less worried that there's a high enough nitrate that it's going to be like problematic for human health. The picture on the left is those 2 really great aquifers that are just great at protecting groundwater. And the picture on the right is that aquifer that covers around 1/3 of the reservation and is just not as good at protecting groundwater. So what estimated times should we be worried about in terms of how things on the surface reaches into the water? According to the Department of Natural Resources, we're going to be worried if it takes about hours to months for something on the surface to get 10 feet underneath the ground. For this exercise, let's focus on the most worrying group, which is the hours to weeks. So that's going to be the bright pink on the left map for the 2 better aquifers and the darker blue on the right for the shallower aquifers. I do want to give you a caveat. The deeper your well is, or the better your well casing is, and that's the tube inside of the well that protects rainwater from washing stuff into your well, the more likely your drinking water is going to be okay, even if you live in an area which is porous and contaminants can seep in easily. That being said, wells that are poorly constructed, unsealed, or fractured can leak contaminants into your drinking water. It takes about $500 to $4,000 to seal an old well or well that you're not using anymore. And if you share an aquifer with your neighbor, then you're also going to be impacted by their unsealed wells because you all share common groundwater. Secondly, taking care of wells are not easy and they can be expensive. I know personally, I grew up with private wells and we never tested our well annually because we didn't want to be stuck with the bill of treating it. I know it's awful, but that's just the reality of human behavior. So this is for the 2 deeper aquifers that are better at protecting groundwater. And I learned this trick from a Minnesota Department of Health staff. I admit it isn't perfect. They're not lined perfectly. I overlapped them by eye. But when you put the 2 maps together, you can kind of see where the overlaps are. So in this case, one of the map is those cultivated areas for agriculture, which are the soils that are better for growing. And then the other map is the pollution sensitivity, or how things on ground can travel into groundwater and how quickly. The areas with the blue circles or ovals is kind of where we're seeing that overlap of that bright orangey yellow of cultivated fields and the bright pink where it takes only hours or weeks for things to get into groundwater. There are not a lot of places for us to be worried about. And that fits with the fact that these are really good aquifers. So how about the more shallow aquifer? When I look at the pollution sensitivity map, which I kind of kept here, I am worried about the amount of blue. Remember, the blue is the hours to weeks where it can seep down to 10 feet below the surface. And there are two maps here too, side by side. Let me just move this a little bit back. On the left, you're going to see sort of like the private wells as those small dots. And on the right, you're going to see those cultivated lands. So I've drawn kind of boxes where I'm seeing that intersection of private wells, of cultivated fields, and of areas of the blue where it doesn't take that long for things to reach the water. So for growers or those interested in raising livestock, I'll just be extra careful about putting fertilizers and pesticides in these box areas. The next section is going to share you some common insights from Western science on how to reduce the use of fertilizer. As Kris will go over, Western science is not the only source. It's just useful to know that these strategies exist because you're going to see them if you read state agency recommendations or even Fond Du Lac's non-point source management plan. So all these methods reduce the amount of nutrients that are going to be in the stormwater runoff. And I kind of made this nifty equation that shows that when you increase fertilizer, you increase water flow, it can be rain or irrigation or a combination of both, then you're going to lead to more nutrients and sediments and rain runoff after rain and snow melts. We looked over many plans, and here are some of the common strategies that are proposed. So the first one is outreach and education, helping farmers feel like they're not alone in reducing fertilizer usage. A lot of these peer farmer groups also offer technical and financial assistance. Finding ways to reduce the amount of fertilizer that you put in the ground, finding ways to reduce manure from being able to wash away after rain or snowfall, and then reducing water from flowing over your lands and being really aware of how climate change might increase that rainfall and being careful about your irrigation. And the last one is regenerative agriculture, which I will let Kris take over. On the side, it's just a really nice rule of thumb for nutrient management. The right nutrient source, type of fertilizer that you need, that your plants are going to use most efficiently, the right rate, so the amount, the right time, and the right place. And that also might be depending on weather patterns. The next two slides are going to go over some more places for you to find information if you want tips on fertilizer application and irrigation. So this is very quickly an intro on how to reduce fertilizer. There's some great groups of links. It is very heavily focused on row crops and Western science, which may not fit your situation. But I put on a screen a picture of how it actually breaks down the recommendation for using nitrogen fertilizer by crop, including alfalfa. And then very quickly, if you want to learn more about Western science techniques, this link is great. It's going to go over again a lot about row crops, but it has some other alternatives, and that you can see how I'm like listing maybe areas that might be relevant that you can use or borrow the principles of. I also included this link because there are funding opportunities that might apply to you. So with that, I am going to switch over and let Kris talk.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I'd like us first to take a closer look at regenerative agriculture, starting at ground level with soil. So if you could give me the next slide, Jocelyn, there we go. What exactly is soil? All soil begins as dirt, a non-living blend of silt, loam, clay, sand, rocks, and pebbles. Over time, a living community begins to grow and die in this dirt. Pioneering plants are joined by other living creatures like worms, insects, fungi, or bacteria. Plant roots help create a stable physical structure where water can be stored and nutrients like nitrogen exchanged. These roots and the activity of worms and other creatures create spaces in the dirt for water and air. Eventually, a layer accumulates made up of a healthy mix of minerals, water, air, and organic matter. This organic matter is key. It includes anything that's alive, like worms, insects, fungi, or bacteria, and things that used to be alive, like dead plants and animals. This special nutrient-rich part of soil called humus is where plants get their food. So coming back to our question, what is soil? You could say Soil is a living organism like skin that covers the land. A vibrant community busy converting decaying matter, minerals, and dead matter into nutrients, maintaining space for water and air that allows for the chemical exchange of these nutrients, and providing habitat that supports thousands of different species of fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. All of this, working in combination, drives Earth's carbon, nitrogen, and water cycles. So roots to system cycles, that's the big picture. But what are the benefits of healthy soil to us, farmers, gardeners, and folks that need to eat? Healthy soils are good at holding moisture. When water is captured and held in the spaces between particles, there's less chance of flooding and stormwater runoff, erosion, and susceptibility to drought. Healthy soils have particles and organisms that work together to filter stormwater or groundwater that might have picked up nutrients on their way to the aquifers or the surface waters. They also maintain stable pH balance and degrade or immobilize pollutants. Healthy soils don't need a lot of fertilizer. They can store, transform, and cycle nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And back again, healthy soils support a living, vibrant ecosystem that enables us to grow the food we need to survive. Next slide, Jocelyn. Healthy soil is the root of regenerative agriculture. But what exactly does regenerative agriculture actually involve? Let's watch this video and find out.
Regenerative agriculture is a set of farming practices that increase biodiversity in soil organic matter. Currently, most agricultural practices are devastating to biodiversity. Even organic agriculture, while not as bad, still does more harm than good. Regenerative agriculture is a way to reverse this trend to actually make a positive impact on the land. So what does regenerative agriculture actually involve? Answering this question is actually pretty tricky, because the practices that work best largely depend on the land that's being worked with. So the variety of different practices border on infinity, a bit more than this video can cover. However, let's look at 3 common forms that regenerative agriculture can take. The soil is full of organisms which are helpful for plants. Some convert soil nitrogen into a plant-usable form. Some bring water to the plants that would otherwise be out of reach. Others loosen and aerate the soil, increasing water absorption and allowing plant roots to penetrate deeper. When soil is turned over by a machine, most of these organisms are killed, so the crops must rely on chemical fertilizer, which ends up leaching into the water. Central to no-till farming is to not do that. Instead of tilling, plant cover crops whose roots break up the soil. Let the worms aerate the soil and bring down nutrients. Keep the soil covered with an organic mulch, which will break down over time, adding more organic matter to the soil. From the release of methane to clearing forests for pasture land, cattle raising is known for being very environmentally destructive. But this is not inherent to grazing animals. If the right practices are put in place, enormous amounts of carbon can be sequestered into the ground, soil can be built, and even desertification can be reversed in a matter of years. Here's how it works. The growth of grass tends to start slow, accelerate, and slow down again. This middle area is where it accrues the most biomass the most efficiently. If it's eaten before it gets to this point, its growth will never speed up. This is what happens with traditional pastured animals. They eat all the grass, which doesn't have the chance to grow back fast enough before getting eaten again, and we have overgrazing. This leads to soil erosion, drought, and desertification. But if the animals are kept in a tightly packed herd, like they used to be in nature, the grass has time to grow before being eaten. All that biomass in the grass is carbon that comes from the air. Not all of the grass gets eaten, however. Some of it gets pooped on and trampled, which ends up creating the perfect conditions for new topsoil to be built. This ends up happening incredibly quickly. This is one of the most complex and location-dependent practices there are. I will therefore be overgeneralizing a bit. It always starts with observing a local forest and the relationships between everything in it. The plants, the animals, the fungi, the landscape, the soil, the water, and then recreating these relationships in a way that's just as ecologically resilient, but produces more food. Food forests are often thought of as comprising 7 layers: the root layer, the ground cover layer, the herb layer, the shrub layer, the low tree layer, the high tree layer, and the vine layer. Every one of these layers either produces some sort of food or medicine, or is in some way helpful to the system as a whole. The plants are mostly perennials and include as many native species as possible. These three examples of regenerative agriculture, plus all the rest of them, all have something in common. Whereas in conventional agriculture, you seek to create as many of one thing as possible, in regenerative agriculture, you seek to create as many relationships between things as possible. You are one of those things. What sort of relationship with the land do you want to foster?
All right, thanks. Thanks, Jocelyn. As you digest what you've just heard, I want to note that the endorsement of just don't till is a little bit of an oversimplification. Systems of moderate tilling can be practiced and still maintain good soil health. And I also want to acknowledge that there are many organic farmers, including in this region, who are currently practicing regenerative agricultural methods like cover cropping. And finally, I want to say that these regenerative methods are rooted in non-Western cultural practices that have been followed for thousands of years and are still in use around the world for efficient, low input, sustainable crop production. Researchers are still seeking and discovering the academic scientific underpinnings to regenerative agriculture. And as they do, they're recognizing the promise these practices hold for realigning our current agricultural systems. So as you can tell, I'm a huge advocate of regenerative agriculture. We've provided a link to another video that complements this previous video. This one defines regenerative agriculture as an umbrella term for a range of farming principles and practices that aim to improve soil health, increase biodiversity, and enhance the water cycle. And you can watch this, the link is in here and it's live, and so you can watch this video in your own time. I want to just quickly go through the main principles that are outlined in this, this graph here, and so we'll hit on them pretty fast. First of all, feed the system, maximize your photosynthesis. Keep those living roots in the ground year-round to feed the microorganisms around them. The video we just watched, you heard about practices like cover crops that keep the soil in place and the worms and microorganisms living near the perennial roots that can engage in those biological and chemical processes that improve or that provide those essential nutrients for the plants. So you don't need the fertilizer, right? And stop seeing soil as an inert medium, but rather as an ecosystem. So when you're thinking about putting on nutrients, think about the impact you have on the whole system. Are you overfeeding your system? Do you need that much? Keep those thoughts in mind. Next principle, keep your soil covered. Try to keep direct sunlight off of the soil. Open and exposed soil loses moisture and carbon, and that's just not ideal for the ecosystems we want to nurture. And how can we do this? You can put mulch over the soil or leave stalks of plants sticking out of the ground after harvest so that through the snows and other seasons when there isn't much growth, the soil is covered. Next principle, minimize your physical disturbance and your chemical disturbances to your soil. Physical disturbances, you can minimize them by reducing tillage, as we talked about, reducing overgrazing, and reduced compacting or squishing out the spaces between the soil particles. When you minimize your chemical disturbances, they can upset the soil ecosystem. Avoid excess use of liquid soluble fertilizer like nitrogen. Again, when you flood soils with fertilizer, you put the natural system out of balance and you inhibit the natural trading relationship between soil microbes and plants. And of course, avoid excess pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides. These disturb the natural balance as well. And just believe and know that as you support soil systems that have existed for generations or build them, you can lower and phase out heavy reliance on chemical interventions. That's a great thing to know. And here we get to a fun one. Integrate animals into your system. Animal waste and disturbance can accelerate and sometimes are necessary for the natural transfer of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in soils. And some of the techniques that you can use are silvopasture, which is integrating tree crops or forested lands and grazing livestock into your operations. The video just before just demonstrated this high animal density grazing over an area, followed by long recovery periods. These techniques are sometimes referred to as holistic planned grazing. Then there's multi-species grazing. That's where you bring in the cows, followed by the sheep, followed by the chickens, and work your way through that way. And then finally, one I like to think about is bale grazing, which involves leaving baled hay out in the field for the livestock to eat as they chomp on it and trample it, and they trample it back into the soil and build the soil up. This is an easy alternative to having to go out and scatter the hay all over the field for mulch. You can just let the animals out there and let them eat and do it themselves. All right, next principle, increase your diversity. This is a vital component of regenerative agriculture. Integrate as much diversity as you can into all aspects of your practice. Some ideas for planting practices are sporadic crop rotation, which prevents pathogens and bugs from working around the more repetitive cycles of corn, soy, corn, soy. Plant multiple crops together, like maybe peas and canola. The combined total yield of two crops can be greater than the single crop at 100% yield. Each plant can help the others stay healthier, so it's basically a healthier plant system. And this is probably inspired by the Three Sisters concept of winter squash, corn, and climbing beans, which originated in Mesoamerica and was adopted later by other Native American communities. Ideas for diversifying your landscape include agroforestry, study your local forest communities, and then create similar forest structures with food-bearing plants and trees, as we saw. Pollinator strips, planting areas that are seeded with flowering plants that encourage healthy communities of bees and butterflies who pollinate your plants too. And wetland buffers that can prevent erosion, flooding, and runoff. And enhance ecosystem health. Think beyond just you. This is a principle that builds on our last point. Consider how your growing activities impact the greater surrounding ecosystems and the whole region. Can you revegetate areas, add plantings? Can you restore plant ecosystems near water's edge, the riparian areas? That's another way to filter out fertilizers and sediments you've disrupted before they can flow into the water. Can you plant pollinator strips, preserve wildlife corridors, and play your part in preventing invasive species from spreading by pulling that buckthorn out of your field? And consider how the water flows across your landscape and find ways to slow it down or capture it and use it. Harvesting the rainwater will minimize the runoff and will also give you water to use. Store water in shallow vegetated channels or direct it with swales. And as we've discussed already, add organic matter to improve your soil's ability to absorb and hold the water like a sponge. Things you can do that just aren't on your land. This is you in your community. Growing food is hard. How do you surround yourself with a supportive community of people who understand the challenges and celebrate the successes? How do you support other people? Take advantage of peer-to-peer learning opportunities like this and farmer-led councils. Support local food production for the benefit of local communities and find ways to help producers keep working their land and actually be able to afford food and shelter themselves. The Minnesota Soil Health Association is an excellent support for everything on this slide, and we'll link you to that a little bit later. And then commit to a learning journey. You're here tonight. I can bet you're already committed. You can read more about this on your own, but it's learning and sharing knowledge with others. Learn from your ancestors, learn by doing new things, and learn and discipline yourself to record what you're doing to better remember what you did. This can be done through stories or through measuring the things in the soil, but do it so others can follow in your footsteps and you can share it. Regenerative agriculture, farmers reconnecting with their roots. This is a powerful and vital movement in farming today. Farmers are steadily stitching ecosystems back together and repairing natural cycles while feeding their communities and revitalizing their cultural ties to the land. True regenerative agriculture is not merely a set of technical tricks for storing carbon in the ground, but it's a holistic approach that values diversity in both plants and people. We at Freshwater, we're not experts on regenerative agriculture at all. If you'd like to hear from folks who are engaged in regenerative practices, these are some experiential experts. Please consider reaching out to any or all of these organizations for more support and information. And just a little note, the Land Access Alliance and the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships are both in northwestern Minnesota. Now, we are going to open up the conversation about Native knowledge. And clearly, I am not an Indigenous person. In particular, we want to point to the importance of Anishinaabe and Fond Du Lac knowledge, the knowledge we have here in this group this evening and that of your ancestors, because no one knows your land or waters better than you do. No one has taken care of these lands, water, and wildlife for longer than you have as peoples of a sovereign nation. You understand the connection and interdependence of all things. You respect and revere the land for the substance it provides. You practice cultural vision that sees beyond present needs and is committed to preserve the land for future generations, seventh generation. You know how to weave food cultivation and preparation into the fabric of everyday life. And how does this all relate to nutrients and fertilizers? Your ancestors survived for generations feeding their families without using any of the current commercial fertilizers. It's likely that their plant knowledge and knowledge of the land, in that knowledge, you already have an understanding, a sense of what foods most likely will be successful with the least additional fertilizer. This quote comes from a Facebook page titled Relentless Indigenous Woman. If, when researching environmental issues, you only believe something when you read leading environmental scientists tells us, you see the world through a Eurocentric lens and operate from a colonized or colonized existence where Indigenous knowledge is not valued. This is a good reminder to me and Freshwater to pause and recognize the limited lens we often default to when we dive into environmental issues. And to remind ourselves that just as diversity is a cornerstone of regenerative agriculture, diversity of cultural knowledge and leadership is vital to not only figuring out how to use less fertilizer, but also how to face all the environmental and socioeconomic challenges that we're facing with climate change. But I'm going to step back and invite us all to listen to Sean Sherman, member of the Ogallala Lakota Sioux tribe and founder of the Sioux Chef, a company committed to revitalizing and reclaiming Native American cuisine and owner of the award-winning restaurant Owamni. We're only going to listen to a small clip tonight, but I urge you to listen to the whole thing when you have a chance. Jocelyn?
So it's the Indigenous communities that really should be the backbone of the regions, because they're the ones, like the rest of the world and Indigenous communities, have figured out how to live sustainably and resourcefully, utilizing only plants and animals of their particular regions. If they're trading with other groups, great, that's an add-on, but people had to figure out how to live sustainably with what they had around them, using plants, using animals, and just using what they had and being extremely resourceful with everything, right? So when we're looking at Indigenous food systems, we're thinking about all parts of it. You know, we're not a triangle. You know, we're not a food pyramid. There's more to us. You know, we have to take into account all the wild foods, permaculture design, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, butchery, salt, sugar, fat production, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, regional Indigenous histories, traditional medicine, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality. All those pieces come into play with our food systems, you know, and we have to look at all those pieces. So this was our map of trying to figure out what we do. Like, we take into account all these pieces when we're trying to understand foods of different regions, different areas, because we know it's not just simple. You know, there's more to everything. So there's so much out there to learn. It's exciting. Like, I love learning new stuff. You know, everybody should be excited about it. So the biggest thing for us, though, is reconnecting with the land and the earth. And it was the plants that really helped us come along. You know, so the plants for us was what really helped teach us. It was something that we could connect to, that we could share that with our ancestors. We were discovering these knowledges that our ancestors had utilized and were using. And for us, that was really important, and it really helped us. you know, and we're learning more and more every day. And as a culinary team, you know, one of the first things we did was hire an ethnobotanist to be better at plants, because I'm just a cook. I'm just a curious cook. I love plants and I love food, and I'm playing with plants all the time. So why not hire somebody who was trained in plants, right? And, you know, for ethnobotanists, it's easier to teach an ethnobotanist how to cook than a cook ethnobotany. So, but, you know, there's just so much great beauty there to learn what we have around us. So this is walking around North Dakota for an hour, seeing so much beautiful color, health with the foods and with the medicine that was just right there in front of us. You know, some people will just look at North Dakota like, oh, it just goes on forever. Like, how can you live out here? There's nothing here. There's so much there. You just have to open your eyes, you know? You have to stop using the word weed, because that just means you don't know what it is. You have to take the time to learn, right? We have to teach our kids the names of the plants. Plant knowledge education should be something that's so important for Indigenous communities to pass down to our children. You know, so, you know, our kids can name off more Kardashians than they can tree species, which is stupid. We need to teach them what's important and what's in the real world right around us, things that can save them, things that they can eat off of, things that they can pass down to their children. Those are the things that are important. Those are the things that we should be saving, because we see, as you know, as a chef, you see so much beauty and flavor. You know, we see sours, we see, you know, like choke cherries, we see spring vegetables. You know, we see the spruce tips and there's a ram's tips. And this picture I bought the wedge at the beginning of the spring. And it's funny because they're coming all the way from Oregon. So I know spring's around the corner. I'm seeing these vegetables in the co-op, right? That's coming to Minnesota. So we know spring's coming when I see them out there. But they're selling the spruce tips for $30 a pound. And then within a couple of weeks, they're going to be all over the city for free, you know, like right outside the door of the co-op, basically. So we're so disconnected for food. We're just like, oh, $30 a pound for this weird vegetable. I'll buy that, you know, but you could just go pick it, you know, there's stuff all around us.
All right. Thank you. He is so much more than just a curious chef, right? Based on what Mr. Sherman shared, there is wisdom in this group right here, learned through experience and education, passed down from your parents and grandparents and shared stories and traditions. And there's opportunity to continue to learn from each other. This is a collection of some organizations and PDFs that hold Native knowledge from across different Native nations. The Wild Rice Health Impact Assessment is an excellent research paper by Fond Du Lac on wild rice. We think there is transferable knowledge in terms of identifying common challenges for other crops beyond wild rice. And also, if you're writing grants that address food security, healthy foods, and public health, there's great language here that can help you figure out what to write, how to write that type of grant. The Native organizations here include Dream of Wild Health. This organization's seed stewardship and rematriation programs return seeds to their Native nations and provide a dedicated seed team to help when communities no longer grow these seeds. Anishinaabe Agricultural Institute works on Native food sovereignty for Indigenous food and farming programs, focusing on traditional agricultural practices. Natives, run by Chef Sherman, who we just heard from, covers food service, Indigenous food identification, gathering, cultivation, cooking, and running a business based on Native traditions and foods. It reminds me of your foraging outing in May. I'd really like to go along on that and see if I can find some of those beautiful things that he was collecting. The Land Access Alliance, which we alluded to earlier, also works with tribal harvesting, foraging, and farming. We highly recommend this organization. And then there's this list of 28 Native food sovereignty organizations from our region, as well as the United States and around the world. And then with COVID still hanging on here, we wanted to provide some online sources. These two seem to have the most trainings and webinars. We particularly recommend the Native Farm to School webinar series. But both have links to First Nations in Canada, and note that the one on the left does have some broken links. And with that, we are ready. I'd like to thank you for listening to both of us. And we have some discussion questions here, but maybe we should see if there are any questions from the group.
Yeah, I saw one question from Sue wondering, I think it was with the bale grazing technique. If you have hay in the field for cows and other livestock, is it the same for wild deer?
Well, the wild deer would be doing the same for your soil as the livestock would be. And if that's who you want to, who's feeding out there, yeah, it would, you can work the same way if you're feeding the deer population. But now I'm not an expert on the wasting, you know, the diseases that might come from this too. So I'm not gonna go beyond that and say they're hooved animals that can nibble on the grain, on the hay, and pound it into the soil and help with the soil health. And I think that's probably the same application. Other questions?
Any questions, you can put them in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask yourself too. That's totally fine with me.
While you're thinking, and maybe you want to put some of this in the chat, did anything that we said tonight spark some knowledge or thoughts you want to share with others in the room, philosophical or practical ideas that popped in your head, parallel thoughts to what we've been talking about? I guess that's us asking questions of you now. Can you see anything?
Well, I think I will, we have a couple more minutes left, so I think I will stop the recording in case people want to chat more freely. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to sum up the recording. I know it's no coincidence that the latest trends in agriculture line up with Indigenous knowledge, and our ancestors, you know, have been developing and passing on this knowledge, and it's something we carry in our DNA and in our seeds. And I know that deep knowing that Erica helped instill through the producer program too has been huge in my own journey with ag. So miigwech to Kris and Jocelyn for highlighting this and for this fascinating presentation. So let me stop the recording.